Oh well, let's get right into Cafe CLIL 12,
Hi
Phil.
Keith, there's the Cleethorpes mug today. Oops,
You've got your background blurred, and I've got a blurred cover.
focus. There we
Oh,
go.
there you go.
Cleethorpes.
I see. Cleethorpes, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, we were talking about the weather, and this is a substantial topic that's going to warm us up, I think, today in this cold mountain temperature that we're in at the moment. It's as meaty as it gets, basically, assessment in CLIL, isn't it?
It is indeed. I noticed Catherine Billsbury made a comment on this, saying that she would listen, but she says it's so traumatic. But she's right because assessment traumatizes children, youths, and you're getting assessed all your life, aren't you? And you're also assessing as well, not
Yeah,
necessarily for a teacher. So yeah, you can't escape it basically. But it doesn't have to be traumatic.
yeah. I mean, there are sort of gates that learners have to go through, and each country will have similar or different systems and gates and ages and stuff. And it's a big issue. It's a big issue. But where CLIL is concerned, obviously we're about the concepts and the language and the procedures. And there's a very nice question from Francis in Australia about that very question. And she asks, what language should it be in the assessment? Should you assess the language separately from the contents? And I know you've got strong views on that, Phil. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, and great that she put the questions up there. And teachers often ask that question. Well, the first question being which language should you assess in? And I think the answer is very obvious, or well, clear anyway. I think that it should be in what we call the CLIL language. Francis said the target language, but since we're saying that we're trying to prioritize the conceptual content, not the linguistic one, the language as vehicle, then to say target language sounds a bit weird because it's target concepts that we're assessing. No? So I tend to say that I think we tend to say you should assess them in the CLIL language. In other words, the language you've been using during the course. Again,
Yeah,
that's a type of validity that will come on to that. I think there are certain circumstances, maybe when schools have just started, the levels of the kids, everybody's a bit nervous, there's a public kind of view of that school's results, etc. You might want to do some of it in the L1, but in the end, no. In the end, you're going obviously to assess in the same language. It makes a lot of sense. The
yeah,
second point, I think about integration. Do you test the content and the language separately? Well, it seems a bit odd because if clearly is about the integration of content and language, then so is the assessment, basically.
yeah,
So that's
yeah,
what you should be trying to do. So what you're trying to do in CLIL, both in hard CLIL and soft CLIL, is to test the conceptual and understanding of the student and of the learner, and you're using language as the vehicle to do that. Doesn't
yeah,
mean you don't. That doesn't mean you're not looking at the language. Of course, the language has to be efficient enough for the student to demonstrate his or her knowledge of the subject. That's what you have to do. And of course, in a rubric, as we said before, in a rubric you can have a language line. It just depends what you specify in that language horizontal in the rubric. But yeah, basically don't separate them. That's what we've been saying in the previous 11 podcasts.
yeah. And I used to, in preparing vocabulary resources for Macmillan, I'd trawl through material looking for language in order to present it. A couple of those vocabulary books that came out were the product of that process. And one of the things I did study was British examiners' reports. And it struck me at the time, we're talking about native speaker learners here, how much the examiner, so the report writer of the tests that examiners have marked, this is a person that would look at all of this and then make a summary conclusion about it all, how much they stressed frequently. It's clear that the student didn't have enough practice in hypothesis statement writing, for example. That's a very clear example, but that's one of many that I found. And of course, if we come back to Biggs, he in his alignment of the ILOs, the TLAs, and the ATs, he would say that that third element must include language that's been used previously. It's not a question of separating it, as you say, but it has to be connected. And Jerry Smith, Helping Bilingual Learners Assess the Curriculum, is a British publication that's again talking about this, not CLIL, but it's EALs and how to help them succeed better and largely in test environments. And what she suggests is teachers could pay a lot more attention to that language earlier on in the ILOs and the TLAs. So I agree. I think it's not about separation. It's about strategy, isn't it? And the architecture of the learning process. And if it's all done well, if it's built well, then your language will be there naturally when you get to the assessment tasks.
Well, yeah, great. I mean, let's start right at the bottom here. I mean, I often when I've trained teachers in CLIL and we've looked at assessment, the best place to start is to say, okay, when you write an instruction, a test or an exam, what is the verb that you use? Now, and of course, you can't get away from it. You ask the student to do something. You say, explain why da da da, or describe da da da. Probably that's it. There's not too many of those. Identify that or list so and so. So, but if you say explain, as you quite rightly say, Keith, if you ask a student to explain something, explain why this, something in physics about, I don't know, friction and weight and force. Explain why this particular thing cannot move in this situation. Well, as you say quite rightly, has the teacher taught the student how to explain? Have they had practice at the kind of structures that implicates, let's say, that brings along, or to explain and describe are very different cognitive functions. They are different. Explanation has cause and consequence. Description doesn't necessarily, and so we come back to cognitive discourse functions, and if you make the students aware of them, if you're aware of them as a teacher, whether it's physics or a language teacher, it's going to help, as you say, align, and it's going to help validity. And we can't get away from that word, can we? It's a valid exam if you've taught the students how to do that. It's not a valid exam if you haven't.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me in producing these vocabulary resources, which is relevant here, is the validity of the input, to use that term that you've brought up here, is I found a lot of textbooks had wide varieties of structures and lexis, and I'll show an example that came to mind as I was thinking about our discussion, and the language of cause effect. And just looking at secondary science textbooks, I used old software to trawl through and find examples of this. You had noun phrases, you had verb phrases, you have kind of lexical verb phrases that you have to learn, like items of vocabulary as well. And that's also part of this alignment, isn't it? The input material can be, the readability of the input material can be way off alignment, when you consider what's expected of learners later. Surely it would make so much more sense to pare down all of that input to a much more manageable quantity of input content language that then could be architectured, as I used the phrase earlier, to come out of the assessment tasks.
That's it. I mean, it's a traditional problem in language teaching, isn't it? When the kids used to say, "Please, sir or madam, what's the exam going to be about in language?" You say, "Well, we've been looking at the past tense. We're looking at this and that and the other," and the teacher would reply with all these discrete items. But you don't need to test people on discrete items. You just say, "Well, I'm going to ask you in the exam. I'm going to ask you to explain certain stuff. I'm going to ask you to describe." If you start from that higher point of view, with the discourse functions or even discourse types, I'm going to ask you to narrate. I'm going to ask you to describe. I'm going to ask you to persuade or argue, whatever the type of exam is. Then the student says, "Oh, okay." So I can look at those, as you say, those discrete items that will be identifiable with
Yeah,
within any of those discourse functions. It's a much easier way of looking at it. It sounds very posh, but it's not. It's actually
yeah.
very simple.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we come back to the actual resources of assessment, in our book, in putting CLIL into practice, we dealt with something that John had written about years ago, weighting risk, I think he called it, and how your test items can carry a light, a medium, or a heavy linguistic challenge
Yeah.
with them. And of course, in a CLIL context, that's crucial, isn't it? That you get that weight of risk right for where your students are and what they've received in terms of teaching and learning to get them to that assessment task. And visual items, for example, with lower linguistic demand, are completely acceptable for certain learners. And when they're asked to write chunks, even in maths, the linguistic demand can shoot up immediately because of it's a blank space, on the test item. Write your explanation here. They may get a prompt like that. Have they been prepared to write explanations in these specific maths contexts?
Yeah. Well, it's about quantity and structure, isn't it? Sorry, quality and structure, Keith. Because if you ask someone to write an essay, da 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 da, discuss. If you write, if you 200-word essay in an exam, then have you taught the student how to structure? Discuss is a verb which requires a certain kind of response. It's what's it called?
Yeah.
The French essay style, isn't it? It used to be called that. Can your students do that? Can your students do that in the first language? It's not just about the L2.
Exactly.
But then again, as you say, it might be short sentences, but in mathematics or in physics, you would need a very specific kind of calc, a very specific kind of academic language to answer those very technical questions. And so it's very different, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the other classic concept of assessment, which is reliability, which means that the internal structure of the exam is reliable. In other words, if the student fails it, is it the student's fault or is it the exam's fault?
Okay.
I mean, there's all sorts to talk about there, but we've only got half an hour. But one important point there, I think, is what you've been saying. For example, if an exam is purely multiple choice, well, okay, procedurally it's easy. Kids like multiple choice because it's a choice between 3 or 4 items. Yeah, easy stuff. If you remember the TOEFL exam, I had the American one for entry into American universities. I don't know whether it's still the same, but I remember it used to have about 100 multiple choice items. You had to blast through it, Well, okay, I suppose the TOEFL result had a certain kind of validity, but is that a reliable exam? To what extent is that testing a student's overall abilities in the language? Well, I don't think it is it? It's testing a certain thing, but it's really strange. So again, the variety of tasks in a test, for example, or variety of tasks during a trimester, during a term that you're going to use for assessment, is also about, well, it's both valid and it's about reliability mainly, isn't it? You're reliably showing that the student is competent in a range of responses. Let's say, you can have essay, you can have multiple choice, and you can drop the language demand, or you can increase it in both ways in an exam.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning the Spanish bilingual program that both you and I have worked on, and actually where we met in Spain the first time. You and I were working with secondary teachers in a training week. Danielle, was it Danielle?
Danielle, yes. Yeah.
And those secondary teachers we worked with were about to receive the first cohort of primary school graduates who'd experienced this bilingual program. And the reason I wanted to mention it is because they had to step up and take the IGCSE exam at the end of their secondary education. And there's a report all about that, which I'll put in the notes, because it's very good reading. It's a long-term program where, let's face it, the children experienced better or worse methods of bilingual teaching and learning. But in the end, the assessment instrument was on a par with native speaker teenagers.
Yeah.
And as far as I remember, they did very well. There was, I think in the report it says there's a 10% that I think the wording was were failed by this process. But 90%, you know, if you think about it, is a pretty good number to come away with. But I think the point I'm trying to say there is, if we're going to assess, it has to be a benchmark that is reliable everywhere. You know, it's something that everybody recognizes is that's where you've got to get to. So in a way, we forget about the language in that way. We do all we can to get them there, and thinking about Cummings, Bix and Kalp and the years it takes to get them on a par with their peers. But in the end, they've got to perform alongside their peers.
Yeah, yeah. I've had a lot of teachers say to me in the past, Phil, you know, we want to do CLIL, but the trouble is we have to pass the Cambridge exams or the IGCSE. Yeah, and you know, my argument is always the same. I said, well, why can't doing CLIL get you through those exams? It seems to me that the main issue of something like first certificate or even the IGCE exams, one of the main issues is the exam technique itself. You know, you do need to practice a little bit, and that's fine. That's part of validity, I would say. You practice a little bit how you're going to do it, you know. But I don't see that, you know, the linguistic range that you get from CLIL, if it works, how can that not help you in something like first certificate or even proficiency, you know?
Yeah.
And the IGCSE as well, the best IGCSE exams that I've seen are very competence-based as well. And so competence-based exams require competencies from the student. So again, if you're doing IGCSE and you're teaching it, then you need to be teaching in a kind of competence-based way for that also to be valid for IGCSE.
Yeah.
That's one of the arguments. That's one of the arguments against the PISA, the PISA tests, because it's very difficult for those, you know, the PISA exams to take in all the different types of curricula and different types of teaching that's being done in all those countries, you know. So there's a kind of validity gap, I suppose. But you know, if you can design the exam cleverly enough, and they are pretty good, then you might get some alignment. I think there has to be some misalignment in PISA, you know. But anyway, that's another.
I've kind of been biting my tongue here for 15 minutes of our discussion, because my heart in my school is informative assessment. Mm-hmm. And my rule of thumb for assessment is find as many information gathering instruments as you can that are fun and meaningful and part of the learning process, and organize them. And one of the things I mentioned to you is all of our children have their own little card folder with elastics on, and every product they make goes in there. They take it home, bring it back, we store them all. So a portfolio approach of collecting products is part of one of the things, of the many things we do. I mean, little whiteboards with markers, individual markers for a prompt from a teacher, write something, turn it around and show everybody. You know, there's all sorts of information gathering going on all the time in all of the classes. And that provides immediate feedback if necessary. It provides a shared assessment amongst the group. And I think, you know, to talk about Biggs again, he was almost philosophizing, I think, with his message. I felt in the work that, you know, come on, it's about learning. It's not about scores. It's not about placing people somewhere in a range of numbers. And he did suggest that we've moved a little bit away from the focus on learning, more to pigeonholing our young learners and children and students.
No, I absolutely agree, Keith. I've been the bad cop so far, haven't I? But I suppose all I'm saying is that, you know, CLIL can't escape, let's say in the state system of any country, CLIL can't escape the fact that students will be assessed, you know, summatively. And so I mean, well, actually, you can put this up later, but there is a great thing, the IFS thing, now about the three words for the ideal type of assessment. It's integrated, it's formative, and it's supportive. I like that. Integrated, formative, and supportive. So if you take those three things on, then we're including both what you've said and what I've said. No? And the cynical view of formative assessment is that, well, it's just leading up to some kind of summative assessment. The more positive view of it is that, well, it's a kind of permanent self-assessment, isn't it? I mean, if I like that thing, what's it called, about low stakes checks. Now, what you do to a term is you have low stake checks for the kids, where the kids aren't traumatized by it. To come back to Kate's point, they're not being traumatized because it doesn't look
Yeah,
like a test. You're just doing little low stake checks to see that they're understanding it. You've got the
yeah,
portfolio, as you said, so portfolios can take various shapes. But with little kids, it's it's just, I did this, I did that, but they are in a sense implicitly reflecting on their learning, aren't they?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
still formative, and you can have much more formal kind of portfolios where you're saying, look, I want you
yeah,
to reflect on your learning, and I want you to reflect on your learning with your friends as well. Peer
yeah,
assessment.
yeah.
Peer assessment's usually important.
Uh, what about Hattie?
Yeah, and Hattie talks about that as well. Talks about the importance of peer assessment, for example. It's high up there. So that's also, that surely he's saying that's contributing to somebody's success in the end when they have to come to do summative assessment.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's really at the basis of what we do in Anglia School, because our summer program, we actually create an end week product, because we sometimes get children who just come for a week, and then we've got children who come for the whole summer. So we kind of package the weeks into project weeks, and there's lots of group work going on to the production of that product which is presented. And oh yeah, I think in a way, it's the, the reason we've come to sit down and talk about assessment is because everybody keeps saying, when are you going to talk about assessment?
Mm.
But the truth is, it's all about the teaching. And that's what Biggs was trying to argue, I think, and did very well in
Yeah.
his work, is that, it's about time education moved to peer shared group self-assessment. And there must be room for that within the wider assessment world that learners have to inhabit.
Well, yeah, and of course, you can also give kids a mark. It's a bit, sounds ironic, but you can give kids a mark for how well they do the formative stuff. I mean, how well have you done your portfolio? How well have you done your peer assessment? How seriously have you taken it? You can create descriptors for that. So in the sense, you can't get away from that thing. You can make that part of it. I remember in the old days, it used to be mark out of 100, and you get 2 marks for attitude or something. But we've moved on from that. I think
Yeah,
moved
yeah,
on from that, and we've understood now that attitude is a competence, and it can be measured. And so in formative assessment, I mean, I know that formative assessment, strictly speaking, doesn't have a mark, but it can contribute to it. How seriously are you taking this
yeah,
stuff? Yeah, peer assessment. I've got to talk to my mate about how well I think they're doing. The
yeah,
teenagers get annoyed by it, but if you take it
yeah.
seriously, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I think so too. And again, referring to Biggs, he makes these two fictitious students up, Robert and Susan, I think he calls them.
Mm.
And Susan is very self-motivated and has lots of skills to get on with stuff. Again, we're talking about a university environment. Robert doesn't. And what we need the learning process to do is to develop those skills in Robert, so that when he is going to be assessed, he's already equipped. And I can see with my own children that a lot of the assessment that they are experiencing it's not about skills. It's about very surface level learning, reproduction. There's very little going on. I'm lambasting all of my children's teachers here by saying this. Of course, there are good teachers, but generally speaking, if you can skim along a surface level, you can do very well in the system. My children are in.
Yeah, the problem will be, I'm sure your kids will be fine, but the problem will be if that alignment, it is a kind of alignment in those schools, The problem would be if those kids move out of that kind of atmosphere of educational alignment and find another one that challenges them, and they say, well, hang on a minute, you want me to express my opinion? You want me to debate? You want me to research? You want me to do all this stuff? You want me to be student-centered? Well, actually, that's great that you've said that, Keith, because that's another thing we need to mention about validity, because the alignment, coming back to Biggs again, is very important. So it's about your, I guess you'd say it's about your teaching style. I could take history because I understand history better than
Yeah,
physics. Imagine, imagine you've been teaching history in a kind of classical way. So it's the kind of facts, events, and personalities kind of approach. That sounds like what you're talking about in Bulgaria.
yeah, yeah,
Facts, events, and personalities in history. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. You need to know the facts. You need to know that it was 1492 for Columbus and not, 1922. It's important to know that. But it doesn't. If it doesn't go any further than that, it's a problem.
yeah,
But you can align your assessment with that if it's facts, events, and personalities. Well, so the test is about that.
yeah,
But imagine if you've been teaching history from a more, inquiry-based approach, a more inductive approach. You've been getting the kids to research, you've been getting them to debate, to express their opinions. Say, what do you think about Columbus's, trip to the Americas and then the subsequent Spanish imperialism? What do you think about that? Do you think it was good for them or bad for them or what? Do you
yeah,
imagine
yeah,
that more sort of open inductive approach?
yeah,
Well, you'd have to, of course, align that in your assessment again. So when you're talking
yeah,
about assessment validity, imagine if you've been teaching the facts, events, and personality mode, and then suddenly in the assessment, you make them do the other one. You make them be all inductive and opinion based, but you haven't taught them how to do that, or you haven't.
yeah,
Well, they're not expecting that. And the opposite would be true. The awful thing about the washback effect in exams is if you've been teaching the inductively and research based and asking them their opinions and getting all this stuff, interesting stuff about history, role playing, all that sort of stuff, and imagine the exam is just multiple choice. Columbus sailed to the Americas in
yeah.
1492, 1592, 1692. Imagine that, and that's all the exam consists of, and some other, boring summative stuff. That
I think what
that would be invalid. It would be
I think
invalid.
it's worth. I'm interrupting you because I want you to say something else about attitudinal aspects, because in a way that's what is left out of these traditional assessment instruments, is the attitudinal side, which I now know you feel is very important to the dimensions we wrote about originally. Say a few words about that, how that fits in with assessment.
Yeah, it's the fourth dimension, and it fits neatly into the formative summative continuum, if you like. Yeah, absolutely. I think if in a competence-based curriculum, then uh, you have to assess, I think, attitudes. And what that means is, I'm not assessing your attitude about whether you're racist or sexist or whatever. What I'm saying is I'm assessing your attitudes towards your work and towards the kind of work we've been doing. So that can be both conceptual and it can be social, let's say. So the social skills that are required in a more inquiry-based kind of curriculum, let's say, you're going to need to work in groups. So you can assess how somebody works in a group. Of course you can. And particularly you can assess the production that they do at the end of that process. You can say, well, it all went wrong. So where was your planning? You were supposed to say that. You were supposed to say that. You didn't plan it. Well, I can mark you down for that. And so it bleeds into procedural considerations as well. So I think that attitudinal aspect, your attitude towards the work as well, your attitude towards peer assessment, we've already said that.
I
So
think we should stop there, Phil.
I can't stop you being a racist, but I can say, well, we've been talking about that for the last month. We've done a project on that, but you still think that? Hang on a minute. No.
Yeah. It's a tidy place to stop. So let's stop there, because it adds that fourth dimension that we've mentioned before.